Alaska, or Alaskuk, is Unangam Tunu, which means the object towards which the action of the sea is directed. More than 730,000 people live here, 8 different ethnic groups, and more than 200 federally recognized tribes with at least 20 indigenous languages.
I am Yupik and Inupiaq.
We are one of the most diverse places in the country.
I was born in American Samoa, a small dot on a globe.
But like the rest of the world, we're not always appreciative and respectful of our differences.
I still think that there is a lot of work and a lot of progress that needs to be made.
As we watch these civil unrest across the country, we're also reflecting on our collective experiences as Alaskans.
This racial injustice has to stop.
I am physically standing up against these 7 white boys who are staggering in height against me.
Homelessness, microaggressions, education, and policing.
At that point, I knew I was just being played with, and I was just being humiliated, and I felt very vulnerable.
From the most vulnerable to those in a position to make a difference, we are one Alaska, many voices. And tonight, we discuss our collective future. Thank you for joining us. I'm Ariane Aramburo.
And I'm Alexis Fernandez.
And we are both Alaskans, born and raised here in the state. I'm from Eagle River.
And I'm from Fairbanks. We'd like to start this evening by thanking the Dena'ina people. Chinan. The Dena'ina have called this land home for at least 1,000 years, and we're thankful for this place, the Alaska Native Heritage Center, and this experience to learn.
For the next 2 hours, we're going to learn who we are as a community, what makes us different, and what's divided us.
We are talking about racism, homelessness, microaggressions, education, and policing. The goal of this program is to open each other's eyes to the perspectives and experiences of others as we strive for equality for all, respect for diversity, and an even greater Alaska.
So I come from a military family. My mom and dad are born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana. I attended a historically black college in South Carolina, and it was there and in my adult life where a lot of people would just question my race. I would get the comments of, "What are you?" They would assume I was biracial, which parent is white, which is black, or I had the good hair and I was light-skinned, but I'm proud of my ethnicity. And to be clear and for the record, I am a black woman.
I am from Fairbanks and attended the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and for the most part my experience has been positive, but our family has experienced racism. My parents immigrated from Mexico to Alaska nearly 50 years ago for a better life, and we were often told by some people to go back to our country. I've also been asked my entire life where I'm from, and when people find out that my parents are from Mexico, they are often surprised.
Now, some of these conversations may be uncomfortable, but to grow, to be better, we have to learn from each other, and that means asking questions and sharing difficult truths. Chinan.
You all have been talking about how systems have failed people. Right now we're talking about the behavioral health system, the housing system, contributing to homelessness. Earlier we were talking about police and the legal system, messing up, black people and Native people and other peoples of color. So the systems generally have failed, right? But it's not a surprise that our systems are messed up, right? Given the history of this country, a country that was founded on the genocide of indigenous people, a country that is built on stolen lands and built on the backs of enslaved black people. It's and a police and legal system that has its roots on policing enslaved people, a legal system that grew largely out of the Jim Crow era. So it's not surprising that our current systems are messed up. It's not surprising that our current systems are unfair, to many peoples of color, right? And so, these little piecemeal solutions, like diversification of the workforce and whatnot, I said earlier, they're not going to work because we need to do something bigger. We need to do something big. The changes need to be big, right? It cannot just be, putting Band-Aid solutions on things. And some people who will say, well, progress takes time, justice takes time, right? I find many times that people who say that are people who are in power, people who are comfortable, people who do not want anything changed because the current systems are benefiting them, right? Because how much more time do they need? Racism has been around in this country forever. How much more time do they need for their progress? How much more time do they need to change the educational system, the legal system, the police? Mao mentioned earlier, they've been talking about diversification for 15 years, but it goes even beyond that. So how much time do people need for this so-called progress of theirs?
We want to turn the discussion now to youth and education. Youth obviously face a lot of new challenges from the digital world, but they're also facing old issues as well. Here's the story of Nishay Andrew.
My name is Skavak. My English name is Nishay Time Andrew. I am a 17-year-old rising senior at Service High School. Life in Anchorage is pretty good. I consider myself really lucky to be able to grow up and to have been raised in the land where my people have stewarded this land. I am Yupik and Anupak. Sophomore year, I joined the Native Advisory Committee to help pass a policy that would allow students to wear their tribal regalia during high school graduation ceremonies. I wanted to create the Indigenous Student Union because for a long time I was bullied and discriminated against because I'm Native, and I knew that it wasn't just me, and so I wanted to create that space for other Native students. Most notably, I am discriminated with my education. Ever since middle school and high school, people are absolutely astonished to learn that I'm Native, because to them it doesn't fit this idea that they have of Native people not excelling in their education, or this Native student having a 4.0 GPA. We are modern, we are present, we are strong and resilient. Our people have strived against so many plights, and we are still here. We are excelling. We are more than what you think as a stereotype. I think the best thing about being Native is that I can draw strength from my identity. And for a while that wasn't the case. For a while I was ashamed of it, but now as I'm growing older, my Native heritage is where I draw my strength from.
And Dr. Bishop, I just want to pose this first question to you, being the superintendent of the Anchorage School District. Education is supposed to be, you know, the great equalizer. We are obviously in some uncertain times right now with having to move to distance learning. How do you make it so that your students within a diverse population have the same opportunities?
You work at it, and you work at it a lot, and put in. It has to be deliberate work because we're doing some equity training, anti-racism training now with staff to understand how to identify it and to see that even those small things that we say and do and how we behave in the system, in the schools, really add to those really that cause greater separation. So whether, I love hearing about this because I've had some work with counselors in assigning courses, and I believe that's probably some of the things that she was talking about, could direct students in one way or another. And we have so many gatekeepers in our systems that if we don't have a look that all children can succeed, then we as adults in the system control that. We recently hired for this year equity officer, a senior leader on my cabinet to focus this. We did an equity audit and really spoke to our students, and they want a change in a curriculum. They want to learn about the Latinx history, and they want to learn about Alaska Native history, and they want African American studies, and so we're working on our curriculum to take a look at that. But even it's not just the books we use, but the assignments we give, why we give them. What are the resources that students have at home that could actually bring those back? I think that we understand that parents at home and the capital, if you will, or the Western capital that some of our families have is going to assist some, and other students wouldn't have that. One of the things that I was looking at the data, and for everyone to know, Anchorage's data is almost double what was repeated all around Alaska. So our largest growing group is two-race, and that's very different than other large cities. I was in a study with other 100 largest school districts and belong to an association, and their mixed race or two or more races, very, very tiny, and ours is growing the most. It's at 16% now, and all of our other demographics are almost doubled with that, and our white population is 40%. And so we are, if you want to use the term traditional minority majority now, and our staff doesn't mirror that. We still have probably closer to those demographics in our staffing. But it comes with changes in the system again, being adaptive and learning and changing and making an effort and catching those things that we do. Where are our brown and black students sitting in the classrooms when you walk into them? You have to pay attention to that. Who's succeeding, who isn't, who's getting in classes, and why or why not.
A little bit about me. I grew up between Dagayakak, also known as Anchorage, and Ungalaklik, where my family is from. So I moved back and forth between Anchorage and Unalaklik growing up. And growing up in this school district, I was relentlessly bullied. I attended multiple elementary schools in large part because of the bullying that I was experiencing, because I was Alaska Native. And to the point where I was beat up on the playground for being Alaska Native, to the point where by the time I hit middle school, I was beginning to ideate suicide. And as an adult, I reflect back on those experiences going through this elementary, going through our school system here in Anchorage. And, you know, I think so much about how that came to be is the fact that what we're taught in schools does not reflect the true history of this place. And so myself, as an Alaska Native person, I would witness and experience challenges within my community, but I would experience them without understanding the context that created them. There was nothing about the curriculum that truly uplifted and valued Alaska Native people. It didn't accurately reflect our history. You know, we were still being taught that the history of this country started in the east and traveled to the west on covered wagons, which certainly does not accurately reflect my people's rich history here on these lands. And all of the ways that what very little was taught about Alaska Native people harmfully situated us in the past, and as primitive and as inferior, and then talking about our ways of life as though they were less than. And to be quite honest, not much has changed. I have 4 children in the Anchorage School District. This is something that I raised with Dr. Bishop last fall, because my daughter was in 3rd grade, which is the only time in the Anchorage School District that they actually do a somewhat comprehensive overview of Alaska Native cultures. And recognizing the experience that my 2 older children had going through that unit, as well as my own experience, I was deeply concerned, and rightfully so, because when the curriculum materials were sent home to me as a parent, to review prior to them being taught, they were deeply problematic. Within the first paragraph of talking about Athabascan peoples, it mentioned that we had somehow colonized ourselves, and it spoke of us in past tense, and spoke of our lives in our villages as harsh, unforgiving, remote. All adjectives that we would never use to describe our rich homelands where we have lived and thrived for thousands of years. And so I raised the issue with Dr. Bishop, how deeply problematic it is that so little of Alaska Native culture and history and our brilliance, our technologies, our knowledges are actually represented within what is taught to all kids. And the ways that we as Native people internalize those messages about ourselves. You know, I heard you speak earlier, you know, about being really proud. You know, you're a proud Black woman, and we want that for all of our children. We want them to stand proud with the cultures that they come from. But for me, going through this school district, I didn't want people to know that I was Native because I was embarrassed, and I was flattered when people mistook me for another race.
I want to go to Jasmine first, Barry. Jasmine, how are you talking to your kids about, we're in a whole Black Lives Matter movement, and they're in education. Are you having to have these talks with your kids about, you know, race issues, or were you having these conversations well before then?
Yeah, I talk to my kids about it all the time. I think some people would argue I did it too soon. My daughter watched The Hate U Give when she was 4. It's just an integral part of our household. And I just piggyback off everyone's sentiments. You know, for me, I went to middle school, elementary school, high school in Eagle River, Chugiak. So on top of being invisible in the curriculum, you were just invisible as a student in general. So it was just this perception of Black people came to Alaska when the pipeline got here, and that was just it. And there was just not really any other discussion, or military. So for me, I try to have these conversations of race with my kids a lot. I think sometimes as a mom, I overcompensate because I want them to be okay and comfortable. And it's kind of sad, because like for me, raising my kids, what my mom told me is, growing up, making a determination on my education, it was almost like you ended up having to pick. If I want you to have a good education, I understand I'm gonna be sacrificing culture at school because it's just not gonna be there, but I'm gonna do my best at home. And I just realized, you know, I don't want that for my kids. I want my kids to know that they are a part of history and they have positive history and they didn't just pop up somewhere. And, you know, and I think that's important when it comes to social issues as well. So when I do events, things like that, my kids were there, they were at the rally, they set the chants. I talk with them honestly, because I'd rather them just know and be aware and have a sense of self in terms of like what we're up against, but then back that with, but it's, don't worry about it because you're awesome, you're the best, you're beautiful brown girl skin, you got this mentality. I would say in terms of education, you know, it goes back to that sentiment that change doesn't have to take time if you don't want it to. I really honestly believe there's no reason we can't incorporate ethnic studies and cultural studies sooner. I mean, I definitely appreciate the study, but I graduated in 2004. We had the same conversation then. Like, we even asked our history teacher, can we just talk about brown people on Fridays, like for just an hour? So I just think, you know, in terms of educating in our kids, I just posed the question, it doesn't have to take that long if you don't want it to. There is ample people that would happily come in and help. There's good resources and books, and I'm just down for that.
And yeah, real quick, I want to give EJ a chance to speak, Dr. Bishop. Yeah, EJ.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that's been shared so far. I think, you know, for many people of color, including immigrants in this country, you know, our success in this country really have depended on how much we understand and how much we've adopted whiteness, right? And the educational system has been a huge part of that. And in many ways, our educational success really has meant nothing but really an indicator of how much we have adopted whiteness, right? And so we need some major changes there. And I think adopting ethnic studies, right, is huge. I think that's huge. You know, teaching our children, you know, the true history of this country, as painful as that might be, I think it's going to be critical. You know, because, you know, the thing is this, right? It's we can easily put ethnic studies on the same level as math and science and reading and writing. I don't see why we shouldn't, and I don't see why we couldn't. Because otherwise, what we'll end up with is just we'll have a bunch of racist scientists and mathematicians.
My name is EJ David. I am an immigrant from the Philippines. I am a father and a husband, and for work, I'm a professor of psychology at UAA. I think, you know, it would be great if people in Alaska understand that Filipinos have been here in this state for a very long time, going back to 1788. And that Filipinos are the largest immigrant group in Alaska. As a Filipino immigrant in Alaska, in many ways it's been great. Alaska has opened many doors for me, given me a lot of opportunities. I wouldn't be who I am today and, you know, where I am today if it weren't for the opportunities that this state has, you know, provided me. But at the same time, you know, it's not perfect. You know, as much as I love Alaska and the people of Alaska, and as much as I've done and I've accomplished here in Alaska, people still mistake me for, you know, someone that I'm not. Whether it be, you know, somebody who is suspicious or somebody who just happens to be, you know, grocery employee, even though I'm not a grocery employee. So, you know, it's the full range, right? Even though the little things are just little things and I can easily brush it off at that moment, you know, it lingers. Airport screening is an interesting experience for me. You know, even though, you know, they're claimed to be random searches, to me it happens too frequently for it to be random. We really are at a reckoning. I think people are realizing now that perhaps being not racist is not enough. I think, you know, being actively anti-racist is speaking up. You know, when you witness something that is racist, speaking up against it. You know, it's not enough to just say, well, it's not me doing it, so it's not my problem.
By a show of hands, how many of you have experienced any type form of microaggression? Anyone want to speak to how do you know, Alexis talked about how do you learn about someone without offending them? How do you teach a subject without it being offensive? EJ, I'm going to call on you. You were in our story. You had mentioned too, you're a professor of psychology, and you said you've often gotten some microaggressions where people will think you're the Lyft driver.
Yeah,
do
Lyft
you
driver,
stop them in their tracks and educate them?
Costco is an interesting place for me. Anyway, wow.
I think for all of us.
Yes, actually. You know, microaggressions. Two important things that I want to share about microaggressions. One, I think it's important to understand microaggressions so that people understand that racism doesn't just happen in an overt, blatant way. Because I think for the most part, many people still think of racism like, you know, like very offensive, you know, derogatory words that you know, people say, or hate crimes even, right? I think many people need to understand that a majority of the racism that we experience on the everyday, you know, on a daily basis now are more subtle and less overt or less blatant, right? And then the other thing that I want to point out about microaggressions is that for those of us who experience it, it's almost like gaslighting in many ways, right? Because it really plays with our minds in many ways, right? We start asking ourselves, what did I just experience? So we start questioning our reality. Was that racism? Was that sexism, right? Am I just being paranoid? Am I just being overly sensitive? So there's already a lot of that, like a lot of questioning of our reality that consumes a lot of our psychological and emotional resources, right? And so for us then to also be asked to now, hey, how do you teach other people? How do you teach other people to not be offensive? How do you teach other people about your culture? That's a lot more, that's additional burden to the burden that we are already experiencing. So I think for all of us, and I'm not excusing myself from this because I've committed microaggressions too. I think for all of us, I think all of us need to be mindful of that and do the work ourselves as much as we can and not put any additional burden on people who are already being hurt repeatedly, whose resources are probably already running dry.
Anyone? Mayor Berkowitz?
I think one of the ways you combat microaggressions is with microaffections. You know, little nice things. You know, will you share a meal with me, or explain to me what? Just nice things. We can be nice to each other. We can be kind to each other. And so much of where we are today, because of COVID, because of the economic issues, because of the massive social issues, there's tremendous stress on everybody. People are lashing out, and they're short-tempered. And I think if we just practice a little more kindness and maybe some micro-affections, that would really go a long way.
Ayu?
Yes. Boy, suddenly I had a whole bunch that I wanted to say in response to what you just said, Mayor Berkowitz. But what it made me think of is the fact that for people of color, for Indigenous, Black people of color, folks, I feel like we're operating at any given time under a triple burden. One, trying to understand contextually why things are the way that they are. We've been collectively gaslit throughout our entire lives, through the education system, through the media, all of these things that feed us messages about ourselves or do that through erasure. And so we're kind of, as adults usually, in this kind of grappling, trying to understand what has happened to us. And then when you come to actually understand the true history that you weren't taught, and you come to understand the outrageous injustice of what has happened, I'll speak for myself as an Indigenous person on these lands and what continues to play out every day, there's this internal reckoning that happens with you. For me, it felt like I was thrown off a cliff to come to understand just how widespread and deep the collective gaslighting had been through my own education here in Alaska on our homelands, on Indigenous homelands. And so you're trying to find out why are things the way that they are, and then you're reckoning with it, and then you're put in a position of burden of then having to educate others. You are the one who then has to tell people, help them to understand and catch them up with the history that they too were not taught in school, and often in the face of rage, defensiveness, anger, tears, guilt, shame, like all of these things that you then have to like comfort them or try and mitigate. That popped to mind when you said microaggressions. Is I feel that then adds additional burden to the person who just received the microaggression to then not only have to kind of reckon with what just happened, but now I have to be extra nice to you in addition to that. I don't think that that's what you were trying to say, but that's definitely one of my kind of reactions to that. And to your question about microaggressions and the way that we have experienced those, I know growing up for myself, I can't even tell you how many times I heard people comment to me that I was smart for a Native girl, or I was pretty for a Native girl. And coming to an understanding of how twisted and double-edged those kinds of compliments are, and the way that you internalize what they're actually telling you, is really rough. The way that shows up as an adult is people saying, oh, you're so articulate, you're so well-spoken, when really what is unspoken in that is you express yourself so well in English, which for Indigenous people in this place, Dr. Bishop said the education system has been the same for the past 100 years. And that's true. And I said earlier that the education system was weaponized against Native people. Here in Alaska and throughout the Lower 48 and also in Canada as well, the state authorized, funded, and mandated the active replacement of our knowledge and seeded really deep seeds of self-hatred, things that showed us that we weren't as good, that our languages, our practices, all of these things were something to be ashamed of. And so right now, to Dr. David's point, success measured by how close to whiteness you are, that continues to show up in our education system. Success is shown by how assimilated you are. If you, like I said earlier, if you're, so articulate or well-spoken, for me, that means that I've gotten further away from my own cultural teachings. I've gotten further away from my cultural knowledge that I so desperately desire and know can help be the medicine for the harms that come with that active replacement. To combat racism, you really have to be able to see it. And one of the ways that we approached that was by never putting ourselves in a position of having to prove that racism exists. Rather, we would create space for folks to be able to share, because we believe that the closest distance between two people is a story. And once you've encountered other people's stories about their experiences, you really can't argue whether or not that is truth or not. What we have found over 10 plus years of having these really difficult conversations about racism is that, yes, it is incredibly difficult, but it's very possible to do it in a way that brings increased understanding and awareness, and also healing and shared solution making. But that requires a willingness to be able to have the conversation in the first place. Something that I wanted to say is that it is difficult to have conversations about racism, but I promise it is far more difficult to experience it, and to experience it all the time, and to have to pick and choose when you actually call it out and want to address it, and then try to get other people on board. And if we move at the speed of comfort for folks to have these conversations, people of color are collateral damage, because these systems are already perpetuating racism amongst us.